If you're ready to unlock more better days, to take control of your health, to push past your limits and unleash your full potential, then you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Bettel. For over 2 decades, I've worked with elite athletes and high performers, helping them optimize their bodies, strengthen their minds, and recover from setbacks. Now I'm bringing that expertise to you through the Vitality Collective podcast. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the science, strategies, and real-world solutions you can apply right away. Whether it's enhancing your physical performance, avoiding or recovering from injury, sharpening your mental edge, or simply feeling your best every single day. With insights from top experts and thought leaders, this podcast is designed to help you take action, feel better, and live the life that you deserve. Welcome to the Vitality Collective podcast, where every day is vital. Joining me on the show today is Siedman, a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator who works at Resbiotic, a company at the intersection of biotech and wellness. Kara specializes in microbiome science, and in this episode, we'll talk about the gut X-axis, connecting your microbiome to every system in the body, the surprising difference between probiotics and postbiotics, and why that missing Akkermansia in your microbiome test might not actually be missing. We cover why chewing your food matters more than any supplement, how coconut oil might be sabotaging your gut health, and the simple dietary additions that support microbiome diversity. If you've been dealing with unexplained health issues or just want to understand the foundation everything else is built on, this conversation's for you. Let's get into it. Welcome back, everybody. Today, I am so excited to welcome Kara Siedman to the show to talk about the gut microbiome. Kara, welcome.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here.
Kara, you and I have had a couple conversations now, and for, I'd say, about a decade, I've been really fascinated by this area of the gut microbiome. And I don't know if it's misunderstood or just plain not understood, because it feels like there's starting to be some awareness around it. When I tell people you have 1 trillion cells in your body and you have 10 trillion bacterial cells that make up your microbiome through every area of your body, so you are 1/10 human standing here, it just blows their mind.
Yeah, we're more microbial.
Yeah. We're just like a vessel for this like ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So I just find it so fascinating, and understanding the power of what these microbes actually do for us, and that it's not just about gut health. It's every system is supported by the microbiome. And your current work now, discovering like lung microbiomes and all this different stuff. Yeah. So I guess let's start with, what is the microbiome?
Yeah. No, you did a good introduction to this world that, is within. I always like to say the world within, or we often consider ourselves a holobiont, right? Or I hear people say, a super meta organism. And so it's exciting because we have a lot more research to understand what does this microbiome mean. And so, to bring it back to the basics. So we have microorganisms within. And so our microbiome is different bacteria and viruses and fungi that live harmoniously within us. And this exists in various niches of the body. So the gut microbiome is the largest microbiome, but we have a unique skin microbiome. Mm-hmm. We have a unique lung microbiome. We have an eye microbiome. We're really starting to realize that there's not really any sterile part of the body, with the exception of maybe this, very thin mucosal layer that protects our microbiome from our immune system. But for the most part, we have unique neighborhoods that exist throughout the entire body, and they talk to each other. And this is a bidirectional link. And this is a term that we've coined at the company that I've worked for now, Resbiotic, the gut X-axis, which explains this bidirectional impact, how the gut microbiome communicates to other systems and how other systems impact the gut. And so we're really just kind of at the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we know and understand. But what we have come to learn is there's not one chronic condition out there that isn't linked back to the health of the gut microbiome.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. And even knowing where to start with that. Like, the first thing I picked up on was the word sterile. You're talking about like there's no sterile surface. And I think over the years, we've sort of been taught that sterile is a good thing.
Yeah.
And you see like that, the hand sanitizer and kids being protected from getting dirty and all the things we do to protect kids from bacteria and getting sick and infection in these sterile environments. And we saw, I think in COVID, all the hand sanitizer non-stop, spraying everything down. This, what you were just saying, sort of leads me to it's not necessarily good.
This is a theory, right? The hygiene theory, which is basically this, are we living in too much of an antimicrobial world, right? It's almost as if, and I've heard other people say this, that, the modern world really isn't made for our microbial world. And there's some truth in that. And we've seen this now with the rate of increase in antibiotic use and what that's led to. But like everything, there's balance. And I always, maybe it's the Libra in me, but we've taken a lot of things to the extreme world, right? I mean, I think about kids that are always having their hands in their mouth, right? There's times that we need to be more sterile or need to be more mindful of the types of bacteria. But we've also moved away from our natural environment helping to prime the microbiome. And so the microbiome has taken a lot of impact from that. And that's a lot of the research. When we look at what creates a sort of dysfunctional or what starts to create or wreak havoc in the microbiome, that is one area that's really being focused on, among other things that we know can create insult. But I think about that a lot. Why is it that we see more robust microbiomes in people that live with dogs or people that work in a garden or get their hands dirty, right? Because we're influenced by the environment around us.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The thing I picked up in what you said was the gut X axis, because a lot of people hear the gut brain axis, right? And that's one of the very, very important links here. But this association that I haven't heard before, like gut X, just that it's everything. Yep,
that's exactly like how I found it. Yeah, X being anything, in when you think about calculus and math, right? I know. I like to say I have a saying is, my microbiome made me do it, and there's like a lot of truth to that, right? Like, hey, it wasn't me that ate the last apple. My microbiome made me do it.
yeah, exactly. Well, and so that's why I think personally I believe there's a new frontier in medicine here.
100%.
And I've been saying this on repeat for years now, but I've never really been all that sure that the testing companies and all this, I wasn't sure how accurate or whether we were getting a picture or we were interpreting it right. But I think we're just getting to this space in this science now where it's really coming out of the niche and into a bit more mainstream. And as we look at vitality, we chose Vitality Collective, not Longevity Collective, because we want to look at these underlying structures that support real high quality of life and thriving in performance and in life. This just has to be such a foundational element.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through, like, we'll start with we'll call it the gut brain axis. Walk us through what exactly the microbiome is doing for us in that regard.
Yeah. You said a really key word, which is foundation. And so one of the ways that I always describe or even explain the microbiome, because I love analogies, is I think of the microbiome as the foundation, like that of a house. So when we're out house shopping, we're looking for all these things that we know we want our house to have. And let's say we find the most perfect house. It's got everything we've ever wanted. What do we wait patiently for? We wait for the structural report, right? Do we have cracks in our foundation? Because if it comes back showing that we do, then this big, beautiful home, this perfect home that we have isn't going to be as resilient, because when that earthquake comes or those winds, or I live here in Colorado, we got bomb cyclones and all the things, then we don't have that stability and that resiliency or that vitality. And that is exactly what the gut microbiome is. So we have all these things that can create insult in the gut microbiome, from our diet to chronic stress to antibiotics and different medications. We call this the exposome, right? All these external factors that start to drive changes. And so when we start to look at the gut x-axis or the gut brain axis or the gut lung axis, all these various axes, we start to look how that dysfunction starts to create systemic inflammation. And so to really break it down, what's happening is, in the research, and actually we're getting a little bit closer. There's been some newer research that was just released like last week, that we don't really have this perfect consortium or neighborhood, I should say, of what a healthy microbiome looks like. We have key characteristics. We have an abundance of your healthy bacteria, your probiotics, or what we call short chain fatty acid producing bacteria. Short chain fatty acids are these very important chemical signals or messengers, butyrate, propionate, acetate, that are produced by our beneficial bacteria that can travel to various parts of the body that have anti-inflammatory, immunomodulatory benefits. But we have a higher abundance of those. And if we have this healthy balance between, it's a neighborhood. You've got some good neighbors, you've got some not so good neighbors, but we all live together and work together, and it's beautiful, right? And we all live harmoniously together. But as that balance becomes disrupted, we have this mucosal barrier. And that mucosal barrier is like a fence that protects, if I look outside my house, I have a fence. So if my dog was running around outside, that fence is protecting him to stay inside versus getting loose. And so that security perimeter, or your mucosal barrier, acts as that secure, that security perimeter that prevents things from getting into the immune system. And so we hear this term, leaky gut, we hear intestinal permeability. And as we start to create this dysfunctional balance, you get a breakdown in that mucosal barrier, and that now allows for things to travel systemically. And so a healthy microbiome is protecting these various points, or these different checkpoints. And when that becomes disrupted, that's when we start to see dysfunction or dysregulation to these various axes to promote low-grade chronic inflammation.
Right. And so I want to pick up that thread. You mentioned like probiotics, and you talked about butyrate and some of the short-chain fatty acids. Some of the terms that people will be familiar with now, probiotics certainly.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. You can go to the store now, and there are just banks of probiotics and all these different CFUs, the colony forming units, and there's 1 billion and there's 100 billion, and there's, it's difficult to know what you're taking and why, and there's women's and men's and all these different things. But there's also prebiotics and there's postbiotics. And so help us with some of these terms. What exactly are the probiotics that we see on the shelf, or as it pertains to the microbiome?
Yeah, so probiotics are basically live microorganisms that, when taken in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit. We mentioned probiotics. So within the microbiome, we have your commensals, like all the different bacteria, all the different microorganisms that are there. You've got some that are more opportunistic. So when the opportunity strikes and they get a chance to increase in abundance, they can start to change and shift the GI environment, or the microbial landscape or ecosystem as a whole. And then you have your probiotics. These are beneficial bacteria that are known to produce all these very important messengers or signals that really have profound benefits. And so a lot of the probiotics that we're taking are all, come from, don't always have to, but a lot of them come from healthy human microbiomes. They're naturally found in the microbiome, and some don't, but they've been studied then to know that they confer a health benefit upon us. So when we talk about probiotics within the gut microbiome, those are your good bugs, right? Those are your
so we're actually
bacteria.
talking about the bugs themselves are the probiotic.
Yep.
Okay, and so then what are prebiotics?
So prebiotics, they're not live microorganisms. They're the food for your probiotics. So I think of them as the fertilizer for growth. So this is coming from your diet. Your prebiotics are, or what we call microbiota accessible carbohydrates in the research. They are coming from your plant-based, your fiber-containing foods but what makes them prebiotics is that they are selectively utilized by our beneficial bacteria, by our probiotics. So we use the term fiber very broadly, but not all fiber is actually prebiotic fiber. And that's really important because, we talk a lot about fiber in the nutritional landscape and why it's so important, from motility to obviously metabolism to the microbiome, but not all of those fibers are selectively utilized by your bacteria. So prebiotics are words like your galacto-oligosaccharides, your fructo-oligosaccharides, your xylo-oligosaccharides, or resistant starches. A lot of people might be familiar with them. Those are the foods that are considered to be FODMAPs. Right. So people who've dealt with digestive distress may have been told to remove some of these FODMAPs, but they're feeding that bacteria and in turn can create excessive fermentation. But they're used by the bacteria to then produce these very important signals like those short chain fatty acids.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a really fascinating thing, isn't it? Like a lot of people will take a probiotic, but in our previous conversation and in others that I've had, it's really interesting that if we don't then feed those bacteria with either through our diet or maybe it's supplements, then they will die off, right? It's a famine state, and that they all eat different kinds of fiber, right? Because a lot of people will say, okay, well, good, I take my Metamucil every day and it's got, or my psyllium husks every day, and it's really the only source of fiber they're getting, even maybe they're getting up to the level they're supposed to. And then there's the conversation, not to throw too much into this, but then there's the conversation around the polyphenols. And this was new information to me, and the other different aspects of the fruits and vegetables that we eat that are then consumed by the probiotics. Yeah,
plant compounds that are consumed.
Yeah.
You know, and I think what is such a important, you know, part of the conversation around prebiotics and around fiber in general is diversity. And it's hard. It's hard to get diversity in the diet. And it's especially hard to get diversity of these prebiotics. It can become overwhelming at times. And the beauty is, you know, especially as a dietitian, especially as, you know, people working in, you know, wellness and in this functional space, is we are looking at that. We're looking at, well, you're getting this decent amount of, you know, a certain type of prebiotic or fiber, but then how do we then fill in the gaps? And I think that's where it becomes, you know, a very exciting area that, like, I'm someone who really emphasizes fiber, but I take additional prebiotics and polyphenols because sometimes I'm just not getting the diversity. So it's not just the number. You know, you hear a lot of nutrition professionals or people saying you got to get, you know, your 25 to 40 or even 50 grams of fiber, but then it's, are you getting it all from one type of fiber? What's that diversity look like?
Yeah. And we'll touch on that a little bit as we go through into the practical section here. But before we do, okay, so we're putting our bugs in, or we've got our bugs present in our gut. We're feeding them.
Yep.
What are postbiotics?
Yeah, this is like my favorite thing now in the microbiome space. Yeah, postbiotics are pretty exciting. I think this is the biggest area of not just microbiome research, but microbiome therapeutic development. So postbiotics, we used to only think of it as the bioactive compounds that are produced by our probiotics. So like many of us are familiar with butyrate as a supplement.
Correct.
Butyrate is a postbiotic. The definition has expanded through lots of research. We have wonderful organizations in the prebiotic, probiotic, postbiotic space. So ISAP is one that tends to be at the forefront. And they've really expanded this definition to also include inanimate or purposely heat-treated probiotics that confer benefits. And so what this means, and I'm going to break it down because it is a little bit of I speak to a lot of professionals, and a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their mind about it. Yeah. And this is pretty like newer research, but what we're starting to see is as your probiotics, as your beneficial bacteria become non-viable or are essentially killed or treated to be entered into a non-viable state, that there actually retains some targeted benefits and viability. And so they almost become like ghosts. So I think of them as ghost probiotics, right? So think of a ghost, right? If I had a ghost here, like they show themselves when they want. It's intentional when they knock something off of, you know, whatever. I don't have any ghosts in my house, but that I know of.
Well, maybe you do. You don't know.
They haven't shown themselves yet. But they haven't quite crossed over. So they're not fully dead, but they're not present here, right? So it's not like I can talk with them and hang out with them. So it's almost like this suspended state where they're maintaining some viability, some targeted function and benefit, but they're not culturable. So if I was to take a postbiotic, a purposely heat-treated, killed probiotic, and I was to put it into some yogurt, it's not going to reculture, but as it enters into your system, those targeted benefits are what exert impact. And so one thing we're doing, and I'm super excited about, is we're actually able to study and understand what those targeted benefits are. So it's a really cool area because it also removes any instability in manufacturing. That's one of the biggest, things we hear all the time in the probiotic space is like, oh, how do we know it actually survives the gastric journey, right?
Yeah.
Well, now we might be saying, well, does it matter? So in any probiotic study, postbiotics are present. And that's what's kind of cool is it's starting to understand more of the action of probiotics because some of the myths around probiotics are that they need to colonize. And I was just having a conversation with a professional about this. And in some cases they do colonize and in other cases they don't, and we don't know why. But is that necessary? And we don't really know. And I think that's what's exciting about, the microbiome field. There were some cool studies that came out of some big microbiome labs looking at the benefit of fermented food. Yeah. And so when you go into a store and you buy your kimchi and you buy your kombucha and it's been sitting on a shelf, maybe you got it in the cold section, but it's been sitting on the shelf. So, there is some question as to, well, how much of that live bacteria are you still getting? But they're still beneficial. Time and time again, when you look at some of these nutritional studies, the fermented foods have some of the greatest impact on modulating the microbiome.
Yeah.
Well, is it because of their postbiotics? And that's what we're starting to think.
Well, that's fascinating, isn't it? Because I've always wondered about that because of this conversation around the dead versus live. Because one of the big breakthroughs recently was, Pendulum.
Yep.
Created a process where for basically the first time, they could produce and deliver Akkermansia, which is an anaerobic bacteria.
Yeah, strict anaerobic. Yeah, it's hard to keep that. Yeah.
And so really, really difficult. And so we started hearing, well, the probiotics don't really do anything, but it didn't really reconcile with the research around, well, people taking probiotics have shorter upper respiratory tract infections and all these things. So that's really fascinating that they actually become, as they die, postbiotics.
Potentially, yeah. And what we're really starting to hone in on, and this is what we're doing, at Resbiotic, is what are those targeted functions? What is that targeted impact? What's that mechanism of action that is helping to, and there was even a cool study that came out looking at a heat-treated plantarum strain that actually showed that the heat-treated, the heat inactivated, so the postbiotic version had different functions than the live. And so this is a really cool area. So I don't want anyone to listen and say, oh, probiotics don't do anything. They do. We're just trying to get a better understanding of, is it because they're live or is it just because there are these beneficial bacteria that retain very targeted, very strain specific functions that exert impact? And that's what's really cool. And so the problem is in probiotic manufacturing, yes, stability and maintaining that live, those are all factors from, storage to shipping to all of that become a very important factor in probiotic manufacturing. Very expensive, very difficult. All of that's eliminated in the postbiotic space, which is really cool.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And so postbiotics then are really how the microbiome, I guess anywhere in the body, leverages its effect within the body, right? And so
they're just targeted, right? So it's retaining some portion of that beneficial probiotic, whether it's, something it produces, a membrane protein, the production of, anti-inflammatory, cytokines that, is basically what's making it beneficial.
Yeah, and that's sort of what I was going to ask then. So you talked about things like butyrate. What do these do in our body?
Yeah.
Or what don't they do in our body?
Yeah. I mean, so for example, we've developed a couple of different postbiotic formulations. One, recently we just launched actually a perimenopause postbiotic, and this is a heat-treated L. plantarum strain that we have done extensive in vitro testing on. And this is just one. I mean, there's a lot of different postbiotics out there, but this is one that we looked specifically at the impact of this postbiotic on the gut hormone axis from both a metabolic standpoint and then also from an estrogen recycling and estrogen balance standpoint. And so we're able to see that as this postbiotic, right, it's heat treated, it's got what's called beta-glucuronidase activity. It actually stimulates the intestinal L cells to promote natural GLP-1. Now, does the live version do that? Of course. And we actually are in the process of publishing a paper comparing the live versus the inactive. And it's really cool to see that, the impact is, if not similar or more in certain situations. And so I think it's just really changing the landscape of future microbiome therapeutics. And I can tell you, like, even just being, at different conferences and ingredients and biotech companies, a lot of people are focusing more on the postbiotics because it becomes so much more marketable. It becomes so much easier. And then it opens up a lot of opportunity to combine and add things. Because one of the unique things about probiotics, especially in the manufacturing space, when you combine live bugs together, they can compete for space.
Right.
This is part of the kind of theories of, well, what's impacting, potential colonization, or what's impacting a probiotic. And there have been studies that done that, where they've looked at two strains that, on its own exerted benefit in different models or had impact, and then combined completely wiped each other out. And so it challenges companies to be doing this research. I mean, I really stand by evidence. But even in we have a lung support probiotic. And what I found so interesting in our studies was that our blend of strains actually elicited a greater and more impactful response. And so we actually show compatibility. And then when you combine probiotics with other things, you can actually degrade them. So it just opens up, the postbiotic world opens up an opportunity from manufacturing, from formulation, from all of that, where a lot of those challenges get eliminated.
Yeah. And some of the stuff that we might have heard about, the links between the microbiome and mental health, and knowing that it will be producing a lot of the serotonin that's in our body, even the melatonin. What's that process? And I guess, where are the other areas that it can be doing similar things? That it's now actually getting into the body and having sort of more distal effects, these axes that we talked about. What are some of the other things that it's doing there, and how is this happening?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to think about this from a pretty logical, sense, because it's like, oh, how are you taking something that you're taking orally in the gut and it's impacting the lungs or it's impacting the brain? And I worked for a previous company that, produced what's called psychobiotics, these strains that have very specific impact on neuroinflammation and brain health.
Right.
And so that's what's so exciting about, I think, the probiotic or even postbiotic research space is we have extensive testing, in vitro testing, from organoid models to different assays that we can start to isolate these compounds. And that's exactly what it is. It's these compounds. So when we look at, well, what's the mechanism of action behind, say, a lung probiotic? Well, we've got these strains that have been harvested from a healthy human microbiome that our founder, who's a very early lung microbiome researcher, saw that, in lungs that were more resilient to disease or conditions, had these strains more predominant or prevalent. And when we look at from in vitro assays to then clinical trial, obviously we see increased short chain fatty acids. So butyrate is something that can cross the blood-brain barrier. Butyrate can promote systemic, reductions in inflammation, can impact the immune system, promote production of your anti-inflammatory cytokines, interleukin 10, and in some strains. So when you get down to that very specific strain, and I should say, a lot of people don't even know what a strain is. And the analogy that I use is, if you look at canines are the same species, right? So all dogs are the same species, canine. But then when you get down to the strain, you think of a Yorkshire Terrier or a Pit Bull. They're very different. They look different. They bark different, the different size. That's a strain. And same thing exists in our bacteria realm. So when you look at the nomenclature, strains are usually a 3-part name. So you can have something like a Lactoplankton plantarum RSV11. That's our strain. But you'll see that 3-part nomenclature. And that's important because that means that bacteria has been studied down to that strain level, and you can extrapolate what that one bug does to a different Lactoplankton strain. Right. And that is so important because when you look at probiotics and you look at just Lactobacillus acidophilus and there's no other name after that, That means probably the company's like swapping out, what's available in the ingredients world. And it doesn't mean that it's going to function the same way. And so this is really raising the bar for finished product companies, supplement companies to be doing the research and also to be doing that finished product validation to take it a step further. But all these different strains will produce these compounds. And when you study how those compounds are then getting felt throughout the body is where that next level of research. So we know that in our lung probiotic that these 3 strains are down-regulating specific enzymes that are more expressed more in certain tissues of the body that promote inflammation. We see that they're traveling through the lymphatic or the thoracic duct to get delivered because then we measure those outcomes. So it's not to say that other strains don't have respiratory benefits, but you don't know unless you study it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's like you go to the pet shop and it's just dog.
Right. like I could tell you my little terrier is not eating what a pit bull is eating.
yeah, exactly. Or a wolf, maybe,
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's important. It's important for people to understand that because to break through the noise in this, probiotic space, this is how we start to dissect it.
Yeah. So let's start digging into some of those areas of benefit. One of the things that I've really noticed in my clientele, in my athletes, is people who get sick a lot. Also, I've noticed have gut issues. They just, whether it's food allergies or any of these different mix or they've always, seem to have some sort of GI distress. That immune system and the gut just seem to go so hand in hand. And I've heard of everything up to like 70% of your gut is in your immune system.
Yeah.
And so walk us through that. How is that link created?
And it's true, 70% of our gut. When we look at, our GI tract, right? We've got tons of immune cells. When something comes into the body, right, those immune cells within the GI tract are essentially determining what's friend or foe. So our microbiome truly is the eyes and ears of our immune system. And when we start to have impact or insult to the microbiome, I talked about that exposome, all those external factors from our diet, from travel, chronic stress, then that starts to change, how our microbiome assesses things. And this is one of the theories around, food sensitivities, decreased immune, is that we lose this oral tolerance. We lose the ability to determine what's friend or foe. And that's why when we look at the connection between the gut to the rest of the body, so much of the conversation is gut to other systems versus systems to the gut. So gut to brain is 90% of signaling versus brain to gut is 10, and similar to the lungs. But it's bidirectional. So if you suffer from, say, chronic stress or anxiety or depression, that can be a driver of dysfunction or imbalance to the gut. Or if you have COPD or asthma, we often see imbalance or dysbiosis in the gut. But vice versa, right? And we saw this a lot actually in COVID. COVID really highlighted, why can you have one person who looks seemingly healthy end up in the hospital and have pretty big complications? And why can you have another person who walks away with sniffles? The microbiome was actually at the center of that. We saw worse microbiome dysfunction correlated to worse COVID outcomes.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And so where does this immune system sort of live in the gut, right? Because it's so important to protect that barrier where we can't have stuff coming out of the gut. Is that the mucosal layer? Like where is all this stuff happening?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of it, so we have our small intestine, right? And we have our large intestine, and majority of the bacteria, the majority of the microbiome is your colon, right? Your large intestine. But a lot of your immune system and those immune responses and all of that is actually taking place in the small intestine. And so it's actually prompted a lot of research, especially around things like IBS, where we have to actually should be starting to look more at the small intestine. That's another big area of research now is what is the small intestine microbiome? You have big SIBO researchers out there trying to understand that, because that is where the bulk of your immune system is. And then you're having a downstream impact. So as things come into the body, right, you've got a thinner actually mucosal barrier in your small intestine, but there's still bacteria there. But you have immune cells, your macrophages, your dendritic cells. and they're sampling everything coming in, and they're either, increasing inflammation and driving, a greater immune response. You've got all these different kinds of immune processes from your Peyer's patches and all those really important immune cells. And then that can have a downstream impact into the microbiome. And so what happens is if you've got dysbiosis in the microbiome, right? So obviously it's a tube, right? Yeah. So everything's running together, but where the microbiome starts to trigger this immune response is when you have these changes that it's throwing off the balance of bacteria. You've got more unfriendly neighbors than the friendly neighbors that you want to live next to. Then that's where you start to break down that perimeter. So the mucosal barrier, that security perimeter in the large intestine, is much thicker. And in fact, it's actually 2 layers. You have this outer membrane area that bacteria actually kind of culminate. You've got mucin degraders like Akkermansia, Oscillospiraceae. You've got some other, mucosal degraders there. And then that inner mucosal barrier, which is sterile. And that's actually one of the areas of the body that is perceived as the only sterile area. And then you have your immune system. And then in that immune system, you've got your macrophages, right? You've got your dendritic cells. Yeah. And so if you have a breakdown in that security perimeter because of that, you've got a lot of unfriendly neighbors. Now you've got certain components of bacteria. A lot of us are familiar with in this community as lipopolysaccharides. Lipopolysaccharides are components on your bacteria, specifically your gram-negative bacteria, that if they can get into the immune system, they can start to wreak havoc and really start to drive inflammation and and increased immune responses, and really start to create low-grade chronic inflammation that can be felt throughout the entire body. But a lot of this is actually starting in the small intestine, and then we're seeing this shift in. So again, you can have a downstream effect, or you can have this upstream impact too. So
we refer to this as the foundation right at the start. And you can see how healing the gut and healing the microbiome can help you in so many other areas, just by improving your gut health.
Yeah, I think of it as like that third leg of the stool. And back in the day, before we had the Human Microbiome Project, before we really understood what bacteria was doing, we used to put a lot of emphasis just on obviously diet and lifestyle and genetics. Yeah. But now the microbiome becomes a big piece to that puzzle as well.
Right. Yeah, and is impacted by those other things, I would assume.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. I mean, listen, you can't... Genes are going to play a big role. Obviously, diet is a huge modulator. But I talk to so many practitioners. I mentor a lot of practitioners. And if we're not considering the microbiome, then we're missing a big area, not just of support and intervention, but of what could be driving some of these things in the first place. And so I'm definitely someone, I've worked in GI for a long time. And I always say I always want to emphasize diet. I meet people where they're at, but the microbiome is often where I start first, because you can then see what improves beyond that. So maybe someone's not, especially not to go completely off tangent, but I was just having this conversation earlier today. When we think about hormones, right, we focus so much on what the liver's doing or what, our body's producing. But a lot of times something like estrogen dominance can appear really in the microbiome where someone's not actually estrogen dominant. So that can change how you intervene and what you're doing with that person to help them feel better. And so I always say, when in doubt, start with the microbiome.
Yeah. I just went through microbiome testing. All right. It's the first time I've done it, and it was fascinating. Everybody's not going to have access to that. So we'll come around to that. But what are some of the first signs of distress, of dysbiosis, or disease that people should be paying attention to? Maybe they're just used to feeling a certain way and just sort of take it for granted. But where should people really pay attention and start questioning the microbiome?
I love that question, because it's often the question I get is, what is the biggest myth when it comes to microbiome health? And it's that you have to have GI issues. But sometimes those are the first signs. We often think of gut health as bloating and diarrhea and constipation and nausea, vomiting and reflux, or food sensitivities and intolerances. But sometimes it doesn't show up in the gut, and things like poor sleep and anxiety and skin health and brain fog, like these are all potential signs of microbiome dysfunction and microbiome disruption. And so it doesn't have to, and that's the gut x-axis. It doesn't have to be that you have gut issues to have a microbiome problem. I think about, I was just talking about, I did a talk recently on metabolic health. And I look at the person who's eating well and exercising, like someone's doing a lot of things like really right, and they present with fatty liver. That's a microbiome patient. That's not necessarily just a metabolic patient. That's a microbiome patient. And so I think it helps to kind of take out the lens and break through some of the sort of systems-based care that we often think in. And this is, again, anchoring back to the microbiome and what's connecting, a lot of this as sort of a central hub. So I don't look at a diabetic patient as just a metabolic patient. They're also a microbiome patient. I don't look at the COPD patient as just a respiratory patient. I also look at them as a microbiome patient.
I really want people to pay attention to what you just said there on the systems level.
Yeah.
I think there's a number of avenues that medicine is going with this traditional medical model that is very siloed and system based. Yeah. And then, what we had in sport, my job was to create these systems that were systems.
Yeah.
Right. We had to impact everything within an athlete's environment, both within and externally, in order to create optimal performance every day. And that meant we had to look at every factor that went into every injury risk factor, every performance facet. And it was never any one of us who had the answer.
No.
We were force multipliers for one another.
Okay.
And I think it's so important if you have a skin issue, if you have sleep issues, if you are getting sick a lot, it's not just your physician and that's it. And we're just going to explore all these avenues until it's just, that's just what it is.
Yeah. I think that's great. I agree. And I think that's really what's exciting about kind of the future of medicine, and where a lot of drug companies and pharmaceutical development is going, is like how to isolate these compounds and how to really look at the microbiome as part of this entire person and body. Yes. And that's why I always go back to, I think of it as the foundation. And no matter who I talk to, I'm going to work on the diet. We want to work on lifestyle, but there's never a conversation that doesn't include the microbiome as part of it. Even when it comes to performance and exercise, it's all part of it. And I think that it's offers just an exciting, but also a tangible area to really have profound impact on people's well-being.
But that's another area we have to remove the silo.
Yeah.
Right. It's not health or performance or exercise. It's just all happening on one spectrum. You can't have any of those without the other.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
We created the healthiest athletes in global professional sport when we were with the Maple Leafs, but it was all on a foundation of health.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't that we did this super, super fancy thing that no one else knows about. We hired an RD full time. We had strength staff. We had physical therapists. We had athletic therapists. We had data scientists. We had technologists. Everything was considered that was very, very foundational. And we built a kitchen and hired chefs. So the food was amazing. Right, the guys actually wanted to eat this amazing food in support of their body's development and their overall health. We created an environment that was healthy with natural light, and
you created an ecosystem.
An ecosystem for them, correct? And that led to performance. Right, that was our house inspection. Right, we had a solid foundation, and then we built this really pretty house on top that was the performance stuff. Right. But everyone wanted to see the fancy thing, right? What's the super, super fancy thing?
Yeah.
And it's like, eating right and squats.
Yeah. Well, and you know what it does? I think there's just like an underlying message to all this. And like, if you think of an ecosystem, right, you can remove the thing in the ecosystem that maybe is of least abundance, but it's going to impact the entire ecosystem. Yes. And so what it means is maybe we don't have to do one thing perfect or all of it perfect, but if we do a little bit of all of this, we create this optimal ecosystem. And it takes a lot of like the pressure off of needing to always eat 100% the best diet, because the reality of it is we should be eating 80-20, but that shouldn't decrease our resiliency.
Yes.
Right? Like if I go and I have to travel and I just spent, 5 days in Vegas, like that rocked my ecosystem a little bit. It shouldn't throw me for, a curve and come back and be sick and be this and that. And so that's where the foundation is key, and they're all part of it. But I do feel like, we put a lot of pressure to be perfect. And there's a lot of things that make up this ecosystem. And I think the microbiome just offers like a very exciting area and an area that we know has, from the science already, from the evidence, that does have an impact on the entirety and the resiliency of our ecosystem.
Yeah. So let's start talking about what we can do about it.
Yeah.
Right. We could take a probiotic. Is there a difference between supplements and your fermented foods or naturally, quote unquote, getting these probiotics into our body?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think what we are able to understand now, because we have the technology to know our microbes more intimately and intricately, meaning what are they actually doing in the body, that we're moving into this more sort of precision and personalized or individualized, like all the buzzwords we're hearing, right? In medicine and health, that we are able to tailor, not necessarily based on, your stool test says this, but what are you trying to either proactively prevent, or what are you currently struggling with that we need to bring support to? So I think probiotics need to be personalized to that. I personally, because of the literature, I don't really believe in a one size fits all probiotic. I think there are probiotics that add a little bit more foundational support, but give you that nutrient dense soil. Like if I need to redo my garden, I'm going to put in some really good soil, but then I'm going to plant the garden that I want to plant.
Yeah.
For whatever it is that I need. And I think that's how we have to think of probiotic therapy. And so does everyone need to take, this one strain? Not necessarily. And so this idea, like a lot of times this kind of, people used to say, you need to cycle your probiotics. You need to change them out. Not necessarily. You should be changing for what you need to be addressing or what you think is, you're trying to prevent, because something like stool testing can do is give you signatures or patterns that may be alluding to conditions or things down the road. But it's not about taking this because I'm missing it or I'm trying to seed my microbiome. It's because I want the function of what it's actually doing.
Right. So we're actually on a more of a goal-oriented approach and an outcome approach versus thinking we're creating the perfect microbiome down here. Yeah. We actually just want outcomes.
Because what actually is, what actually is creating a more optimal microbiome is what you're feeding it, is your diet, right?
And so that's where I wanted to go next, is the foods that we're taking in. And we alluded to some of this early on. I said I wanted to come back. There's a lot of skills that go into increasing your fiber intake.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Do you know how to cook vegetables? Do you have the knife skills?
Yeah.
Right, to not slice your hand off when you're starting to prepare vegetables for maybe the first time. So how can people start this process of identifying sources of fiber? What do you mean when you say different kinds of fiber? So I think let's hone in on fiber a little bit. And where people start with that.
I love talking about fiber because it's the diet is controversial, right? Yeah. Like, what's that right diet? And, protein and fat and carbs, everything's been, and unfortunately, we've really moved into like a carb phobic society for metabolic reasons, for longevity, for all the different reasons. Yeah. And obviously we could have a whole nother podcast just talking about diet, but I think that's done a disservice, to obviously not just our microbiomes, but even our psychology around eating. So fiber are plant-based foods, right? Fiber, we have soluble, we have insoluble. These are non-digested, compounds that get broken down by our bacteria. And get fermented by our bacteria. And so they help with motility, blood sugar, cholesterol, and of course, microbiome health. Mm-hmm. So when I give a general sense of what are foods that contain fiber, they're generally your plant-based foods. So from your whole grains to your nuts, to your seeds, to your beans, to all of your fruits, to all of your vegetables, including potatoes, right? But really all of your plant-based foods. Now, what happens is we modify these foods, like brown rice to white rice, right?
Right.
Where we strip that fiber down to make it more digestible. And there are reasons for that. And there are times when we should be emphasizing more of that than others, especially in certain conditions. But all of your plant-based foods will contain fiber. And then from fiber, we have these specific components that we talked about, your prebiotics. So these are going to be more emphasized in onions and garlic and your berries and your nuts and seeds and beans, right? Beans and legumes, are great sources of prebiotic fibers. And then from your prebiotic fibers, you have different kinds. So for example, resistant starch, which is such an interesting prebiotic fiber because it's both insoluble and soluble.
Okay.
Your resistant starch is found in things like your green bananas, right? So I'll eat green bananas, but for like 1 or 2 days and then they turn yellow. Right? I'm not going to throw them away because I bought them. Right. We're going to use them in things or, rice and potatoes that have been heated and cooled. So this might not be something that's as robust in my diet because it's coming from a very specific type of food.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where then we can start to utilize some of these external sources. But for the most part, like when I talk about nutrition and I talk about, well, what's the optimal diet? We really want, half our plate, I always say, coming from vegetables because vegetables are obviously high volume foods that can help increase satiety, but they also have all those beautiful colors, those polyphenols, the antioxidants, the fibers, all of these, sort of, medicinal and beneficial components within them. Yeah. And then a quarter of our plate should be from carbohydrates and a quarter of our plate should be from protein. We don't exclude, fat's kind of intertwined. We don't exclude any specific component because we only have 3 macronutrient groups and we should be consuming them. We should be. I mean, right? Carbohydrates give ourselves energy. You come from the athlete space and the performance world, right? Exactly. What happens when you don't consume carbohydrates, right? Yeah. And the problem is we just have moved so far from this sort of basic understanding. We've overcomplicated a little bit of the diet system that now it's become confusing. And I think that's, I go back to the Libra in me that we have these things and we need to create balance. Yeah. And there are times in your life when you're dealing with certain things or you've got certain things going on that we have to modify that. And that's on a personalized and individualized basis.
Yeah. I want to go back to two of the things you mentioned, and we talked about them earlier, polyphenols, antioxidant compounds. Like, how are these, what are they, how are they getting, how are they beneficial to the microbiome?
Yeah, so polyphenols are specific plant components that are basically utilized by certain bacteria to produce sort of these key signals. So for example, we know that certain bacteria can consume pomegranates or consume certain berry components to produce postbiotics like urolithin A, right? So they also increase the diversity of the diet, again, because they're utilized by our bacteria. So anything that's selectively utilized by our bacteria is going to modulate and have some impact on the microbiome and then therefore impact beyond. So antioxidants are, components that help to, decrease free radical production and reactive oxygen species that we know drive inflammation. So your antioxidants have anti-inflammatory components, which is why notoriously when you go back to what foods have been studied the most when it comes to disease prevention, it's your plant-based foods because they have all these various components that really attack these things that we know can wreak havoc. Yeah. Even fat, some of the best studies that I've looked at fat on the microbiome, we lived through a day in an era of time where it was like coconut oil for everything, right? Yeah. You broke your arm, put some coconut oil on it. Yeah. And we know that as we consume fat and as we eat, bacteria die. And as bacteria die, they release components. We talked about that, postbiotics, right? But I mentioned those lipopolysaccharides being components that naturally circulate at, low and healthy levels in a healthy microbiome. But when you have this dysbiosis, when you have a breakdown in your mucosal barrier, when you've got this inflammation that's felt, lipopolysaccharides really drive a lot of that immune activation and inflammation. Right. And they've looked at various types of fats on the impact or the rise in lipopolysaccharides. This is a term called metabolic endotoxemia, which is a term that is describes this sort of inflammatory reaction from your from these lipopolysaccharides that happen after eating. And they've looked at this in fat. And so they looked at the difference between coconut oil, omega-3 fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids, your polyunsaturated fatty acids, your monounsaturated fatty acids. And they found that coconut oil actually had a much greater endotoxemic response.
Fascinating.
It is. And so it just goes back to looking at the person that you are talking to and what you're doing from an interventional stance. So someone who I know has signs of dysbiosis, they've got lots of symptoms, their gut's a mess, like all these things that are pointing to a microbiome problem. I may say to them like, hey, chill out on the coconut oil. Let's replace it with some of your omega-3s, your monounsaturated, because that actually has no impact, and start to shift that. And that's where we do have to personalize these approaches.
Yeah, and I think that's a real cautionary tale for people, that whenever you're reading about or listening to anyone talking about the diet, anyone that has this big bias towards or away from like whole macronutrient groups, I think you've got to be super cautious, because I really think that to create this whole ecosystem, if we know that different bacteria eat different things, we have to eat a wide variety of things.
We do.
If suddenly we take like our macronutrients of carbs, protein, and fats, and we really balance it towards one of them, that's what's going to happen to our microbiome, right?
Oh, yeah. And we can see this. So when we look at like really high protein diets, carnivore diet, paleo diet, right? Listen, if you're someone who's following that and you feel amazing, awesome. There are things you can do to support your microbiome. You can take prebiotics, right?
Yeah.
But what we often will see is if you are, and this is where stool testing can actually give us some of that insight, but if you are extremely dysbiotic, right? When you consume a lot of protein in a meal, protein first gets denatured in the stomach. It takes a lot of stomach acid to do that. And for many of us, we see a lot of low stomach acid, or there are a lot of times where we don't have enough stomach acid. So when we consume a lot of protein in one sitting, we have to really make sure that we have enough stomach acid and enough digestive enzymes to break those and denature those amino acids, because when you have larger protein molecules that are getting into the microbiome, the more dysbiotic bacteria there, the more unfriendly neighbors, the ones you don't want to live next to there, they consume them and produce byproducts that can actually drive more inflammation, that can drive more negative health consequences. It's a term called proteolytic fermentation. And so, there's so much out there now on like really high protein diets. Like you got to get 40 to 50 grams, at breakfast, which is like so much. I mean, I will often, when I talk to people who are doing that, I'm often making sure that they're taking some extra bitters, taking some extra enzymes, because that's a lot to break down. And then you're leaving a lot more for your microbiome. And 80% of people are walking around with some form of dysbiosis. Again, it kind of puts things in perspective and kind of draws us back to like, well, what does it mean to be balanced? And do we have to consume that much, right?
Yeah. Can you explain digestive enzymes then? Because we haven't touched on those and where they fit into this whole mix.
Yeah. So, our body produces lots of different enzymes from our mouth, which is why chewing is so important, right? Our saliva has amylases that start to break down carbohydrates. And I always tell my patients, like, take a bite of bread and like keep chewing it, and eventually it'll turn sweet, right? So that's your saliva that's breaking it down. So carbohydrates will start getting broken down in your saliva. Chewing is one of the first steps of proper digestion. And then food enters into your stomach, where you've got your pepsin, your hydrochloric acid, all of this that combine to break down and start to denature your proteins. So break them apart into some of their amino acids. And then food enters into the small intestine, which is where fat, initially gets broken down. And then our body produces all these different carbohydrate enzymes, disaccharidases. Your pancreas then gets signaled to produce lipase and proteases. So bulk of digestion, actually, all of it is actually happening in the small intestine, which is why a lot of digestive disorders, we think back to, well, what's happening in the small intestine, or if there's been damage to the small intestine, what is that? And so ultimately, it's the job of your small intestine to produce all these various enzymes, cholecystokinin to trigger the gallbladder, to release bile, all of these processes, so that when food enters into the large intestine, it's broken down into its basic building blocks, your basic amino acids, your glucose, all of your basic sugars, so that the bacteria then can ferment it. And so if you have larger protein or larger fat molecules, then it's more work for the bacteria. And there are certain pathogenic, opportunistic bacteria that prefer protein and fat than others. And that's when you start to have all these byproducts that, the end product of fermentation. Obviously, if there's carbohydrates and prebiotics there, that end product of fermentation is short chain fatty acids, which are extremely beneficial. If you have too much protein there, then the end product of fermentation can be things like ammonia and polyamines and P-cresol that in really high amounts can start to cause problems.
Right. It's so interesting to me. Again, I go back to people always want like a real fancy answer. Like, oh, we're talking about the microbiome. Like, give me the
probiotic
secret, right? Give me the secret. It's like, chew your food.
Yeah. And we do. We have to go back to the basics. Totally.
This mechanical, like your teeth, right?
Or the environment that you're eating in.
Yeah. And it's so fascinating to re-emphasize why it's so important to be excellent at foundational elements.
Yeah.
Before you start skipping steps and thinking you've got to do this latest crazy thing that's on the latest podcast. Chew your food, eat your vegetables. And we've gone through the gamut of the different kinds of fiber. So you need different kinds of vegetables and the polyphenols. So eat all the different colors.
Yeah.
Right. It's such an important part of what we're trying to get across as practitioners.
Yeah.
Shouting through the noise. It's a really critical message.
And when you can't do that, don't feel bad. That's when we seek out the right types of supplements. I always say the definition of a supplement is to replace what's missing, right? Or to take something at a therapeutic value that you're trying to get more of to create a change. And so that's and that's why I meet patients where they're at. A lot of people ask me, well, what's the one thing I should do? And I'm like, well, there's not one, but what's the thing you're willing to do? Because anything you do is good. Yeah. And that's why there's not necessarily a hierarchy, although in the GI tract there is when we're trying to sort through digestive issues, there's definitely a hierarchy. What are you doing here? What are you doing? What's happening here? What's happening here and down, or upstream, right from there. And so, but really when it comes to these lifestyle changes, there's a lot of opportunity to create change. And I often want to meet people where they're at. Yeah.
So you talked a bit about a hierarchy, and as we get close to time here, I'd love to hear about, okay, what is the hierarchy when you're talking to somebody and we want to address the microbiome? What is that process that we're going to go through?
It's a good question. And I do think it changes per person. I think about all the patients, I worked in intense GI for, 10 years. And so people that were really coming in that were having lots of issues, and most everything was linked back to the microbiome. And so for me, one of the first areas I look at, obviously outside of just diet, right? How do we need to use diet either to change to help our symptoms so that we can do some work within, or what are we really lacking? And one of the first areas that I really think about is, what are we feeding the microbiome? Because in all honesty, your prebiotics, a lot of times we think about, well, I must not have this bacteria, or I'm missing this. And a lot of times and we have microbes that have gone extinct, as we've migrated and industrialized. But for the most part, we've got these bacteria that we know are part of a healthy human microbiome, but a lot of times they're on life support. They're just not there. And so that's where I'll look at the diet and start to think about, well, what can we change, or what do we need to add in just to start to shift that terrain, just to start to create a little bit of an environmental change.
And you and I talked about this actually just before we hit record. I told you I got my results last night.
Yes.
And the flag for me and the microbiome was that I had 0 Akkermansia.
Yeah.
Right, one of the keystone species.
Yep.
And so you were talking me through, well, maybe it is there, it's just on life support.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Talk me through, okay, give us a practical example, a real world example. I'm your patient and I've got no Akkermansia.
Yeah.
What do we look at?
So that's a great question, because we have other keystone strains, or these important, I think of keystone strains as your star player on a sports team. We're like, the Instagram influencer of the microbiome, as we'll like to say. So they influence, they have a direct impact on the overall health of the microbiome. So I look at the ecosystem. I think one of the difficulties that we have in the microbiome space, and stool testing can do this, is we look very isolated at who's not there or who's there. And remember, it's an ecosystem. So when I see that people are missing keystone strains, like say, for example, Akkermansia, I look at other players. What's bifidobacteria look like? Because actually they cross feed each other. So do you have a lot of bifido, and that might be like, okay, maybe they're there and you're doing things and it's just not showing itself. And again, also I will say too, stool testing is a snapshot of time. It's a baseline. Right. Your microbiome does shift and change, but for the most part, it's fairly stable, but you can have a different looking test. That's why there's been some new tests that have come out that are doing more longitudinal sampling where you're getting multiple a day, every day.
Oh, wow.
There's some really cool advances. And that's great because then you can actually get a better sense of what your microbiome looks like. If you take a 2-week sample where, let's say you poop twice a day, every day, you're getting 14 samples a week,
Yeah.
That's really cool. So I look at that. So I look at, who else is there or who else isn't there, right? Because it's an ecosystem. Just because you don't have it doesn't mean you don't have a healthy or well-functioning microbiome. Are we not feeding it what it needs to be fed, right? For it to do its job. What does your short chain fatty acid production look like? Do you have other not friendly neighbors there that could be also degrading the mucosal barrier? Well, then maybe it looks like, so there are these patterns and associations. Right. And so I look at those patterns and associations. I don't just look at isolated microbes.
Right. Yeah. On my report, it was sort of above average.
Okay.
I got a pretty good grade with some of those red flags. What would be a practical step that I could take to help that keystone species out?
If you have good abundance of other bacteria, then we may just be doing some things to help support the growth of that. Right. So giving targeted polyphenols or giving resistant potato starch. We have a prebiotic that selectively feeds. Yeah, Akkermansia and bifidobacteria love resistant starch. And so maybe those are things that are lacking that we want to give it. So that might be something we look at. I look at, again, other functions. And so that's why we don't think of the microbiome similar to what we talked about in systems care. We don't think of the microbiome as an isolated system. It is an ecosystem. So what don't you have? What's missing? What do you have? But what functions are actually being carried out by the microbiome?
Yeah. Even on that testing piece, it's interesting because that came back on my testing as I'm missing. I am taking a supplement, an Akkermansia. I'm taking Pendulum's Akkermansia supplement. And I'd actually forgot to stop taking it when I did the testing. So I thought it was really interesting that it wasn't showing.
Yeah.
But what I know is missing, I don't eat green bananas. We haven't prepped potatoes that heat and cool.
Yeah, I don't
eat
that.
Prepped rice that heat and cool.
Nope.
And so it's just not been in our routine. And so it's interesting. I'm also not really feeding Akkermansia then, like based on some of the stuff you're saying.
That's such a good point to make. And I think what makes the microbiome space complicated, I mean, this is well beyond a lot of general knowledge, but we think we should take a probiotic because it's seeding the environment. You're a very good example of you're taking the probiotic, you're getting the benefits of Akkermansia. So, of course, the metabolic health, the gut barrier support, and I would be interested in seeing your other tests actually, and we can do it offline and I can look at some of those patterns, but
maybe we'll do it online.
We can do it online. I'd love to. I can like really dissect your poo.
Do a little short episode on. Yeah.
I'd love that. But what that is really telling us is exactly what the research right now is showing is that we don't know why one person can take this specific probiotic and see it, right? Colonize. Because generally speaking, probiotics are tourists. Or I heard someone recently say, like, it's like staying in an Airbnb. You come in, you enjoy it, and then you leave, right? They're not colonizers. And in some people, they do colonize. We don't know why that is. We don't know what's happening that is making, and we also don't know that you don't have Akkermansia. It might just be the strain that they are pulling out. And that's one of the unique things about Akkermansia is your body could actually be making its own Akkermansia strains and it's just not being detected. So you may actually have it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm really excited, and I think maybe if you're up for it, we will do that
Oh,
as
happy
an
to.
actual episode. We'll do
Happy to.
a consult of what that actually.
You got to send it to me first, though, so I can actually see it.
Oh, I will. Don't you worry. Like, we'll do this properly. Yeah, that's going to be really fun.
Yeah.
And so, okay, then let's talk testing then, right? What tests are available?
Yeah.
What tests should I be looking for, or what should I be looking for in a microbiome test if that's a route that I want to go?
So there's different tests out there, and I definitely, am unbiased in terms of, any one test. I think what we look at when we compare one test to another is the technology that's being used.
Yeah.
We have very sort of old school technology, what's known as 16S and PCR testing. Right. That's been around for 40 years, right? And hasn't really changed and evolved. And then we have what's called whole genome or shotgun metagenomics, like deep shotgun sequencing, which is looking at the entire genome. So I use the example of 16S being like, let's say I took a picture of you. Yeah. I cut up that picture. Yeah. And then I blew that picture up, right? I amplified it. And then I stuck it up on a wall. Well, I might be able to tell that maybe that you're a guy and that you have, darker eyes and that you have maybe you have a beard or brown beard. But I can't tell that it's Dr. Jeremy Biddle, right? Right. So that becomes, an issue because when you start to look at the genes, you can maybe tell who is there in a sense, but you don't actually get what they're doing. Where whole genome sequencing is actually sequencing the entire genome of that bacteria. So you not only see who is there of that microbiome, but you see what the functions are. And that's why you can look at certain short chain fatty acid. Like you can have missing keystones, but then you might have really good short chain fatty acid production that can determine how then you go about restoring or improving the microbiome. And so I like that because it just gives you a fuller picture. But it's also more complicated. I think the microbiome, we come from very conventional training where it's like, I call it the point and shoot, like kill what you have an abundance of and try to seed what you don't, that very, and it's just not as simple. And that's why I say, like, when I look at something that's missing, I look at a lot of other things because if you have an abundance of other things or you don't have it, then we can start to see how that ecosystem is responding. Right. Yeah.
And so then I get my results back. Who then should I talk to about this? Because I know my physician doesn't really know this world. So then where do I go with my results to get a plan?
That's a great question. So as a provider, if you're ordering a test for a patient, many of the companies that are available out there, they have consultants, on their team that are there to talk about the test, talk about the patient. And that's a really great offering that all these companies have. And I've done every test under the sun. Right. As a consumer who's ordering their own stool test, I think that's a little different. And that's where, you have companies that are geared towards consumers that are giving, interpretations. But I always say as a consumer, as a patient, I would seek out someone who obviously is offering these tests because then they will probably be able to interpret and guide you down an interventional path that is geared towards you. Because I think if I wasn't knowledgeable in this space, I'd look at this and I don't know how I would even remotely begin to go about it.
Yeah, I tend to have a bias towards RDs.
Yeah, I do too.
Because I think that there's, for this and my blood work, everything goes to my RD.
Yeah, I love that.
And I think that's just such an amazing skill set that people, I don't think, value enough. This amazing skill set that an RD has that literally builds your body. Yeah. Right. First and foremost, that's sort of how I view food. It's the building blocks for as we exist standing here. Yeah. As we've talked today, it's clearer and clearer that starts in the gut. Yeah. Right. And so I think the training that RDs have it's so powerful. So I think that's where I would have people start.
And I'm biased, and I would say there's many RDs who are not, trained well enough in the microbiome. What I will say as a dietitian, I became a dietitian. I was pre-med. I come from a family of physicians, and I became a dietitian because I really viewed food as that bridge between allopathic and more, functional or integrative. And that was really my reason for it. And I 100% value the conventional training. I worked in the ICU. I worked in the hospital.
Yeah.
I worked in all these because it really did teach me how to think about the body, not as individual systems and silos, and to really be that investigator. And I truly value that. I think, there's not all RDs that get, microbiome training, but I think because of that, and so that's why I love even, doctors that have come from conventional training and have moved into functional, because I think they can start to bridge that versus thinking one or the other. And I always appreciate that so much. But I'm also biased towards RD. Being
I think that's fine. Let's go with it. So we have traveled far and wide in this conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. If this has resonated and people really want to start improving their microbiome, maybe they can't get tested, right? So they're going to sort of be flying blind a little bit. Based on what we've talked about today, what would be your top 3 takeaways for people that they could go away and prioritize for the health of their microbiome?
I love this question. I always have to stop and think when people ask me these takeaways. I think one thing that's really important for, anyone listening, because obviously we got pretty deep into the conversation, but your microbiome is really that central hub, right? It's one of the most powerful levers that we have for pretty much all aspect of health, right? It's not just about digestion. It's this gut-X axis that influences truly everything, right? And I think one of the most important areas to start, and if we're willing to, is to look at the diet. It's not about, I need to replace this. What can we add to enhance the density, right? I'm someone who will sprinkle chia seeds and basil seeds and different mixes into the things I'm already eating, right? Because I think when we start to take away, there's an emotional component. So what can we do that enhances? Maybe I'm already consuming vegetables. Well, what can I add? A different vegetable, right? Can we do 2 instead of 1, right? I'm eating a salad. Can I add some beans? Can I add some nuts? Can I add some seeds, right? I think if I'm someone who loves white rice, can I do half white rice, half brown rice? There are such simple steps that we can take that truly amount to profound benefits, right? And nutrition, it doesn't work. Nutrition, there's no rigid rules, right? It's there to strengthen every system of the body. And so how can we increase that diversity, right? How can we focus on some of these foods that we know nourish the microbiome? And I also think, when it comes to the microbiome and when it comes to gut health, what is it that we are either struggling with in our own personal health journey that we can start to isolate these targeted strains or these targeted products? Or what are we proactively trying to prevent? Maybe we look at our parents and we look at our, brothers and sisters and say, oh, wow, there's a lot of metabolic disease in my family. What are these things that we can take that we know then support that, right? Maybe we add some extra prebiotics. Maybe we add some of these things in to enhance what we're already doing. So it doesn't have to be these major steps. It doesn't have to cost, $1 million. But where can we start to supplement? And then where can we also start to enhance? The third thing I would say is when we look at the diet in particular, when it comes to the microbiome, one of the more exciting areas of research that's come out is the impact of these ultra processed foods. Now, we didn't even get into that today, but that's where I start to say, okay, well, how can we look to reducing some of these things that we know are 100% impacting the gut environment, right? So looking at some of these additives, and that's something I love to do in the grocery store is if I have my favorite cracker, well, it's not to say let's get rid of crackers, but could I find the one that doesn't have carrageenan, that doesn't have that doesn't have all these emulsifiers and additives that we know could be adding to this dysbiotic environment? Can we look for the ones that are using, more whole grains and seed flours or nut flours, right? And the beauty is we live in a really diverse food environment that these options are out there and they're available.
Yeah. Amazing. And Carol, where can people find you, follow you, and learn more about the work that you're doing?
You can definitely find me on Instagram. I'm very active on LinkedIn as well. So connect with me. I'm always open to discussing anything in the microbiome space. And then I currently work for a company, Resbiotic. We are at the forefront of this sort of precision biotic space. We're a company, I say that we're a company that's at the intersection of biotech and wellness because we're doing all of this work to understand the exact functions of the strains, the postbiotics, the probiotics that we use. So you can absolutely follow us there. We have social media, Resbiotic. I'm super active on their social media channel and trying to just give some gut advice and microbiome advice. So happy to reach out, LinkedIn, Instagram, send me messages. But any gut health questions, I'm your girl.
Amazing. This was just such an amazing episode. The work that you're doing with Resbiotic, I just think it's so valuable, and I genuinely believe this is that next frontier for us in medicine. Yeah, so thank you so much for your time coming on the show today, and I am very excited for our follow-up show where we break down my microbiome test.
I can't wait for that. Thank you for having me on. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. That was a truly fascinating conversation with Kara Siedman. Here are the 3 key takeaways from today's episode. Number 1, think of your microbiome as the central hub and foundation for all aspects of your health, not just digestion. The gut X-axis influences everything from brain function to immune health to metabolic disease. So when you can't figure out what's going wrong with your health, start by looking at the gut. Number 2, focus on adding diversity to your diet rather than taking things away, because what you feed your microbiome matters more than trying to seed it perfectly. Sprinkle chia seeds or basil seeds on foods that you're already eating. Add a second vegetable to your plate. Mix half brown rice with your white rice, or throw beans and nuts onto any salad to increase the variety of fibers that you are feeding the different bacterial strains. Number 3, look at your personal or family history to choose targeted probiotics or prebiotic support rather than taking a generic one-size-fits-all approach. If metabolic disease runs in your family, or you're dealing with specific symptoms like poor sleep, anxiety, or skin issues, that might be a signal of microbiome dysfunction. Seek out strains and formulations studied for those specific outcomes. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the show is to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts, leave a rating or a review, and send this episode to somebody that you think would benefit from hearing this message. It makes a real difference in helping us reach more people who could benefit from these conversations. You can stay connected with us on Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube at Vitality Collective Performance, where we'll share additional insights, behind-the-scenes content, and updates on upcoming episodes. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.